commodities and the oil and gas being like two very diverse sectors coming together to protect and defend the infrastructure that we got here. So we thought we'll combine a little bit of thoughts from the different angles. Let me introduce a friend, Tobias Whitney, who's here from VP at Fortress Solutions, and next we'll go to Scott Algier. So I'll go by the way I see this on the screen. Scott, I've known him for several years now, mostly as the champion of information sharing across the IT sector, making sure the right information flows across to make the right decisions, right? Then I'm joined with my good friend and fellow colleague at EY, Mr. Brian Levine. Brian works across the board on transactions and the cyber due diligence that precedes transactions, and the day one integrations that you probably go through yourselves. So we work very closely on our day jobs, but outside that, Brian has a great thought leader, has a lot of observations and writings out. And Brian, from his experience, has been the Deputy Assistant General for the Department of Justice, and as a prosecutor brings in that perspective. And then we have our good friend Stephen Singh from Zscaler. And Stephen's background really intrigues me because I think he has seen both the financial sector as well as IT sector, goes across the board, and he's also responsible for the M&A part of it, being part of an M&A team on a technology company such as Zscaler. I think would give a great perspective as to how we bring all this expertise together to address the challenges that we have on the energy security and energy infrastructure. So I'll kick off. The moderator's prerogative is to have someone at hand with Tobias giving him the first salvo. Speak a little bit about his background, and then we'll go around the room and go through your perspective. So Tobias, after you.
Okay, and thank you, Val. Appreciate it. Appreciate having the opportunity to share some insights this afternoon about critical infrastructure security, specifically in the areas of oil and gas and electric power. A little bit about me: 20 years, 25 years or so in the SCADA security area. The first 10 years, I spent most of my time doing attack and penetrations. I guess you can call me a grown-up script kiddie. I sometimes say that proudly, but it's been a few years since I did that kind of work. Started it with PwC and then led the cybersecurity practice at Burns & McDonnell, designing control systems for critical infrastructure. And then the last decade or so, I switched from design and consulting and engineering and worked on the policy side of the equation, and led the cybersecurity efforts at NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which at the time had implemented the first set of mandatory cybersecurity standards for SCADA and control systems, and led that for a little bit over 6 years, and really had a good bird's eye view about the impact of policy and some of the things that we're starting to see, especially as it relates to pipeline security, and how regulatory oversight changes the landscape in terms of how many critical infrastructure organizations apply their resources to security. And then over the last few years, took some of that expertise and worked within the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, if anyone's heard of that, focusing on, frankly, the emergence or challenges between innovation and regulation. We're seeing some of those challenges play out now. One of the things that you probably have never heard of is leveraging cloud infrastructure for SCADA. We're going to start seeing that probably in the near future. We're already starting to see that with distributed energy resources from electric power perspective. Also looking at the advent of electric power vehicle infrastructure, energy storage technologies, and things of the like. So that'll be the perspective that I'll be covering today. But I'll also be touching on a bit more of some of the work that I'm doing with Fortress as it relates to asset vulnerability management for critical infrastructure, as well as illuminating and securing supply chain. So that'll be the focal points of my discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Tobias. Scott, how about you go with you next?
Sure. So just brief introduction about myself. I'm Scott Algier. I have a cybersecurity consulting company called Conrad Inc. And through Conrad Inc., we support various information sharing organizations and provide cyber threat intelligence. So we've been running the IT ISAC for the last 16 years or so. So my team provides the analytic support to the IT ISAC, producing the daily reports, the incident-specific threat reporting, and we leverage we put indicators into our threat intelligence management platform, TrueStar. For our members, we facilitate the sharing across the membership, and we also provide the daily administrative support of the IT ISAC. My team and I also, through the IT ISAC, support the CompTIA ISAO. There's a partnership between the IT ISAC and CompTIA for the IT ISAC to provide the operations and analytic support to the CompTIA ISAO and their membership of MSPs and MSSPs. And then my company also supports the Cyber Share program, which is it's the ISAC for small broadband providers, which is sponsored through the NTCA. And these are companies, telecommunication companies, are mostly in rural America. So we do other things as well, but that's the general highlights for today.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. Brian, sir, how about your background?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Brian Levine. Pleasure to meet everybody. I am Managing Director of EY's Transaction Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Group. This group is a very unusual group. It's approximately 30 cybersecurity and data privacy professionals that just focus on the context of transactions. So we work on mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, restructuring, going private, going public. And we typically get involved in the diligence phase. We've conducted over 600 cybersecurity and data privacy diligences, many in the energy sector, over the last 6 years. And then we'll typically stay on and assist with the integration, if it's a divestiture, any separation, or stand up of a new cybersecurity and data privacy organization. And I am a non-traditional consultant. I joined EY 2 years ago from the US Department of Justice, where I was actually a cybercrime prosecutor and national coordinator for the other 300 cybercrime prosecutors around the country. Prior to that, I was a regulator with the New York Attorney General's office in their Internet and Technology Bureau. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years doing technology litigation with some big law firms, Morrison & Foerster in Palo Alto, better known as MoFo, and Paul Weiss in New York, which is a good firm but has no funny abbreviation. So I made this switch from, pure law to what I do now at EY because I was kind of tired of going in after the fact, after the damage was already done. I could go after the bad guys and I could get them. Sometimes it took 10 years and they'd serve time in prison, or I could litigate on behalf of the victim company. But ultimately, it didn't do that much good for the victims. And so I decided if I could make a difference by preventing some of these things from happening, rather than just going in after the fact, that might be doing more good for the world. So that's what I've been doing at EY. A lot of our work recently has been in the energy sector. And in doing a lot of this work, we work closely with Stephen Singh over at Zscaler. So maybe I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself.
Absolutely. I didn't even have to try that. So, hey, Stephen.
Val, great to see you. Brian, thank you for the graceful handover. Pleasure to meet everyone today. And as Brian mentioned, from Zscaler, one of the largest global cybersecurity cloud platforms in the world. And what we do is provide zero trust platforms for our clients. And obviously it provides incredible integrity, continuity, and security and cyber resilience. Some of our largest clients in the world utilize this platform to accelerate their transactions, mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, carve-outs, joint ventures. So what we'd like to share with you today is what we're seeing across the energy, utility, oil and gas space. It is certainly a very active sector. The more active, the more announced, the more focus, the more threats, and some of the techniques that we're using to modernize this environment. Similar to Brian and Val and a few others, I came from management consulting, also ran global IT organizations and financial services and CTO as well, where we saw how to do things the hard way during a transaction, which is a time of duress. And during times of duress is when threats are the greatest. There's now more modern approaches of how you migrate your solutions from old to new and utilize the cloud to its fullest extent. Something we're hoping we're going to see the energy, utility, oil and gas industry start to adopt more of, and previous industries have taken advantage of it. So we have a lot to learn from there as well. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Absolutely, and thank you. And in the next 30 minutes or so we are here, I would like to tap into your collective wisdom, and maybe start with Tobias here. In terms of protecting the critical infrastructure, especially in the energy sector, what is your view in this today's world where you have supply chain issue, we are dealing with hardware issue, we are also dealing with talent issue, and you represent a technical competency in this to protect it with the efficiency that we need. So your perspective, sir, on.
Well, that's a really big question. So there's a lot of challenges from a critical infrastructure security perspective. So let me kind of take a bit of a step back. So 15 years ago, the electric power sector was concerned that many of the systems that were used to keep the lights on, the process control systems, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems would be managed by, Microsoft or systems that were considered commonly off the shelf. And that concern caused quite a few folks in industry to react. And the reaction was something called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards. And that was 15 years ago. And 15 years since, there's been a challenge for industry from a regulatory perspective to demonstrate compliance on a daily basis with the potential risk of $1 million fines if they don't effectively demonstrate compliance. 15 years ago, we've been doing that. So there's been quite a bit of maturity that we've seen happen over that time, but we haven't seen a tremendous amount of innovation, okay? But one of the things that we're starting to see now, especially given the advent of what happened last year, okay, we had a colonial ransomware attack with our oil and gas pipeline infrastructure. Even though that attack didn't necessarily permeate the SCADA and control system side of the equation, at least that's what we know from a public source perspective, they proactively halted their operations and production that impacted a tremendous amount of infrastructure in the Southeast. That particular infrastructure is not managed by any type of regulatory, was not managed by any mandated set of regulatory standards. So now we're starting to see what happened 15 years ago in electric power start to happen now for oil and gas and the related pipeline infrastructure. So one of the challenges that we learned over the years, especially having to deal with mandated set of requirements, and they span from supply chain to vulnerability management to patch management, is that sometimes, if not implemented correctly, and some of the folks maybe at Zscaler might be able to touch on this as well, is that we may not see the proper level of innovation. Obviously, if you're focusing on security, you want to do that. But the concern is if you're heavy-handed from a regulatory perspective, you might not achieve some of those best practices in technology. So I think that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with as it relates to SCADA and some of the emerging regulations that we're seeing in the space, is how to apply a regulatory environment, a set of mandated requirements that don't impact or even stunt the appropriate innovation within a particular space. Okay, so one more point as it relates to innovation. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of change within the electric power area. I've talked about 15 years of standards and requirements, but what we're also seeing is a tremendous amount of adoption of technology as it relates to energy storage, clean technologies, electric vehicle infrastructure. Now, why are we seeing quite a bit of that? Because we're seeing a need develop to be able to leverage more renewables. 32% of the electric power infrastructure is sourced by the oil and gas infrastructure. 32%. It's a tremendous amount of reliability from that perspective. So again, I think one of the biggest concerns is understanding the regulatory landscape. There's going to be a lot of change along those lines, but making sure as we see that change, as we implement those new standards, we're not too terribly heavy-handed, and we allow for the effective innovation of security and technology in the area.
Lovely. So Tobias, I think you touched on quite a few points. I'll probably keep the same order we have been talking about. Let's probably go to Scott and understand or try to get a sense of how the information sharing community and also the visibility that you provide across the sectors or sectors help probably throw some light on how can we use a collaborative approach to address this big gap of 15 years, like when NERC started. Now we have a TSA SD2.
Yeah, so thank you, Val. And also in my introduction comments, I forgot to thank you for the invite and for the Cyber Future Foundation for putting on the event. So thank you very much for the opportunity here. So it really is an interesting dynamic. We've been having this, and I've been doing this for 20 years. When I first got into here, we've been having the same debate, right? Regulations versus market. And I think there's always that tension between regulations and market, but I think the ISACs fit into this market-based orientation, because whether it's the ISACs need to respond to the needs of the members, and the needs of the members are always changing, both based on the technology that they're deploying, the security threats that they're facing, and the policies that are being implemented by government. So our regulatory policies require companies to adjust, which require the ISACs and information sharing communities to adjust. It requires us to adjust in multiple ways, both in the type of information we're providing, right? Because there could be regulatory needs around specific technologies that you need to make, or that specific technologies in your environment that you're operating that need to be secure. It could be reporting requirements that your company has that the ISACs can help provide data for and information for. So I think the ISACs, whether there's your industry has high regulations or whether your industry has no regulations, I think there's a role for your ISAC to assist you in managing risks to your enterprise. And it's a really good collaborative tool so that you can talk to your other peer companies in your industry about how government intervention, government regulations are impacting your industry, what adjustments you need to make internally, and you can talk with other peers about lessons learned from their experience in implementing these regulations. Maybe they've already gone down this path, and there's a roadmap for you that you can use. So again, to wrap it up, I think the ISACs, both in terms of cyber threat information, regulatory compliance, it's increasingly recognized that participation in an information sharing forum was a sound cybersecurity practice, as well as the peer-to-peer collaboration. There are multiple opportunities for information sharing organizations, and specifically critical infrastructure ISACs to help your organizations manage risk.
Well, thank you, Scott. I know I can't overemphasize what you just said about the information sharing community and how they can bridge the gap of the 10, 15 years we have from the maturity in the power and electric sector versus what's happening in the oil and gas sector. So with that, let me go to Brian. And Brian, sir, you have seen across the board from your previous roles and now with the role at EY, you are probably at the front end of many of these issues when people try to acquire new assets, so to speak, and then go from there to integrate into this current. And what I am really concerned, and I think many of our leaders in the community, is that we have a disparate and quite disparate attempt at getting power and utilities and oil and gas at the same maturity level. So your thoughts around that, and how can we get this addressed upfront during transactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. So the transaction landscape, the M&A, when a company acquires another company or divests or any of these transactions, that turns out to be one of the most risky times in the corporate life cycle from a cybersecurity and data privacy perspective. And that's been especially true during the COVID period. And it's true for a couple of reasons. The first is when you have the transaction, as soon as it's announced, what we're seeing is, due to the increased visibility, and especially during COVID, both parties to the transaction just see a huge spike in the number of attacks. It's usually exponential. And that's the first thing. And often one of those companies, one of those organizations is not quite as prepared for that huge spike in attacks as the other. Sometimes it's both, but sometimes it's often the target company, the company that's being acquired. So that's bad to start with. That's a problem. But at the same time, there's other factors making it worse as well, which is that these transactions cause a huge amount of distraction. So you can imagine that employees from both organizations find out about this transaction. They're really worried. Am I going to keep my job? Is my role going to change? Am I going to be moved over to the other organization? Am I going to have to move geographically? And they're very distracted. And so they're much more likely than usual to click on a phishing email or to fall victim to social engineering. It would not be surprising to these people that they would get an email from somebody that they are not used to getting an email from, because they're now part of a new organization. So that all puts them in a bad shape. And, add to that, it increases the insider threat, because these people don't know what's going to happen to them after the transaction. Hopefully it'll be really positive, but they're just not sure. So might as well download everything that they've ever done or have access to, just in case they're going to be looking for another job, and or putting themselves with the best foot forward. They may have very positive intentions with it, but all these things happen at the same time during a transaction. And so, what we think about in terms of transactions, there's two kinds of risks. There is the counterparty risk. And the counterparty risk is that the company that you're acquiring may already be breached, or may already be not compliant with a whole variety of regulations, or that their environment may be so poor in terms of controls and compliance that it's really just a ticking time bomb. And so, these are situations like Verizon's acquisition of Yahoo. Didn't go so well. Yet Yahoo turned out to be breached. Luckily, they found out about that before consummating the transaction, but they sort of agreed to share risk on that. And so far, it looks like it may cost the combined entity $2.8 billion in terms of the cost of that breach. Another famous one is the Marriott Starwood. Marriott went to acquire Starwood. It did not know that Starwood was already breached at the time of the acquisition. And as a result, it integrated, and the infection from Starwood went over to Marriott, and both entities were infected. And that one also has likely cost Marriott Starwood at least hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and class actions are still pending. So that's the counterparty risk. But the whole other piece is the transaction risk, which is what I was referring to earlier. Around the time of the transaction, both parties face increased risk. And there's an additional factor. If the party getting acquired didn't have the regulatory obligations of the acquirer, for example, say the acquirer is a public company and the target is not, the target suddenly has to comply with all these regulations and higher standards and greater scrutiny than it's ever been used to. And so this is all a recipe for concern. So here's what I would say. There's no magic bullet, but the first thing is, you want to start thinking about these cybersecurity and data privacy concerns as early as possible in the transaction. And what I find and not infrequently in these energy organizations, but across the board, is that the CISO and the people who are most focused on cybersecurity and data privacy are often the last people brought into these transactions to think about them. And that's not great. They need time to start thinking through all these issues early. And part of that is doing appropriate cybersecurity and data privacy diligence during the diligence phase. Because if you don't start identifying risks and figuring out a plan to remediate them during the diligence phase, then you're limiting your options. You're tying your hands in terms of the exposure that you might be putting your organization through, but also in terms of how you can efficiently resolve these things. If you come up with a plan and do appropriate diligence up front, you can dramatically reduce the risk and take some basic steps to protect the company going forward. And similarly, with respect to integration, if you have a plan for integration from a cybersecurity and data privacy perspective that starts with diligence and continues on forward, and is a very focused, planful exercise, you're going to result in a much safer organization, a much more efficient integration, and you're probably going to end up finding and maintaining and capturing a lot of synergies and cost savings that you wouldn't necessarily catch otherwise if you just sort of say, all right, there's $2 million versus synergies here, but we have no plan in terms of how we're going to capture that. So planning this out from the beginning is really important in protecting yourself during these transactions.
Excellent. So thank you, Brian. I mean, a lot of this point definitely resonated with me. I'm sure a lot with our audience here too. With that, let me turn to Stephen on his perspective. I think Zscaler, one of the pioneers of cloud security field, and also before Zero Trust became the buzzword. I think Zscaler had the prior implementations of that. How do you see this in terms of the technology landscape that we live in, Stephen?
Absolutely, Val. Thanks. And if I just pull back the aperture for a little bit, why are we here? We think about the energy industry, it's going through profound change. It's being driven by, what we call energy modernization, migrations towards renewables, as Val mentioned, but also carbon neutral footprints. And if you think about that, it plays itself beautifully for acquisition. How do you move into a net new industry such as renewables? More importantly, plays into divestitures because you can start to shed your threats and your footprint by reducing geography. So we're going to continue to see this because the energy industry is going through profound change. Choose whichever subsector you'd like. As we think about, grounding this with client conversations, and it's a very popular topic, how do you protect yourself during a transaction? I thought Brian did an eloquent job articulating a broader perspective. I'll zone into a couple of things. Speaking with a client earlier this week who they're seeing almost 4 billion security events a year, 4 billion. That's unprecedented. Thousands of actual investigations from these security events. And the question they happen to have is, how does this scale as they, number one, start to shed assets which are no longer geographically desirable, but two, as their attack surface grows through an acquisition? We've seen, once again, common threats in the energy sector for quite some time. Great examples we saw, once again, whether it's a supply chain attack, a ransomware attack, a watering hole attack, there's no shortage, but there's a pattern here. We saw this 10 years ago in industries where the money happened to be, which is financial services. So there's a lot of best practices that I strongly believe in from a regulatory standpoint can be applied. Where we've noticed the deficiency in this industry, 2 areas. Number one, there are a lot of regulations, and it makes it very challenging for a client to figure out which check mark do you want to hit. NERC, FERC, CMMC, once again, tie it back to your NIST framework and ISO 27000, your head is spinning. The second place is, and I think it's really the foundation of this conversation, there's a talent shortage. And once again, regulatory compliance are great if you can have a group that's knowledgeable, well-versed, they can plan, prepare, respond, and prevent. And I think that's one of the things we should also bring to light is how do we help tackle the talent shortfall? Now, to go back, I like keeping things really simple at Zscaler. We do things really well around Zero Trust, which is a concept and strategy, but being deployed by thousands of clients around the world. First of all, prevent compromise. That's the first thing. How are you connecting the most atomic units, your users, your applications, and your systems together? not at a layer 2 level, but at an application layer where it should be, and applying least privileges along the way. Number 2, how do you prevent lateral threats? If you take a look at previous announcements and the plethora of ransomware attacks, lateral threats actually are what have made this so much worse, providing open connections, once again, from an acquired entity or an existing entity. And the third one, prevent data loss. It sounds kind of easy, but when you have a cloud environment and you're migrating to your favorite cloud service provider, your favorite data storage provider, you'll realize by the time you assess that space, you have dozens, maybe hundreds of repositories that are out there today that you probably didn't even know about. Your shadow IT group is paying for it by their Amex credit card. So I think there's tremendous opportunity to keep things simple. If we can do those three things, preventing compromise, preventing lateral threats, and preventing data loss, using that as the foundation for the policies and regulations, it makes it a lot easier for an IT, but also an OT/ICS organization to meet those regulatory requirements.
Well, thank you so much. I think that kind of sums up the landscape we live in. There are so many new technologies coming up, and the whole digitization that we have been talking about across the board in the energy sector, be it P&U or be oil and gas. I wanted to turn the discussion towards the people that we work with, the stakeholders, right? I mean, nothing beats working with the right people and setting up the right stakeholder group to work with. Tobias, maybe turn to you about who do you work with and who do you aspire to work with to get the word out to make sure that we work collectively addressing this.
Yeah, that's a great point. The people side of the equation, and what's the stakeholder mix of critical infrastructure security. So I'll start from the landscape. I know we started with a whole lot of discussions around the regulatory footprint that we're starting to see in oil and gas, and that we've seen for 15 years with electric power. But that is on the asset owner, asset operator side of the equation. The one challenge that we're starting to see, and this has really been emergent in the last few years, is what about the technology providers that provide the infrastructure for oil and gas and electric power? There is next to zero specific mandates and regulations associated with them. Now, the asset owner operators, your utilities that ultimately manage this infrastructure, have all that burden to deal with. But the stakeholder challenge that we're starting to see is, well, when we have the SolarWinds issue, the concern is that I have one vendor, I have one particular type of system that is incredibly ubiquitous, and it has a potential impact and footprint to a broad swath of technologies. Well, if you take SolarWinds, which is predominantly in what we call an IT system, and you swap that out and make it an OT system, the potential impact of a SolarWinds type of event, it could be catastrophic for oil and gas and electric power. Okay, because there's a tremendous amount of dependency on those third-party technology providers on that said infrastructure. Meaning, most critical infrastructure organizations do not custom develop in-house the technologies that are used to keep the lights on, keep the pipelines flowing. That's incredibly dependent on those third parties. So that's a big piece of the stakeholder mix, is recognizing how to bring the suppliers to the table, make sure that they understand, given the unique aspects of these critical infrastructures, that they're providing technologies that are secure before and upon implementation. The other part of the challenge, and this was brought up in the previous administration, seeing more direction with the current administration, is how do we deal with FOCI? And I don't mean Dr. Fauci, I mean FOCI, okay? I mean foreign ownership, control, and or influence, all right? What does that ultimately mean? Well, in the previous administration, DOE, DHS, and basically it made it very clear, we're not supposed to be utilizing, purchasing, or installing technologies from Russia, China, Venezuela, North Korea, and a few other places, Cuba, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one. They sent out information to industry and said, hey, okay, I've told you to avoid making those implementations. We like more information. Industry responded back, said, wow, that's a huge swath of technologies. How do I avoid potentially China and utilizing China for my footprint from a technology perspective? The administration came back and said, you know what, I hear you. I'm going to prohibit China for anything associated with critical defense infrastructure. Okay. Since then, we've backed off that with the current administration. There's a new request for information that's due in a couple of weeks in November. But the point is how do we deal with foreign adversarial influenced technologies for the most critical infrastructures on the grid? So you talked about people. That's probably one of our largest, most challenging issues right now is where is the hardware coming from? Where is the software being developed? What are the components that make up both software and hardware bill of materials? I know there's a supply chain session coming in after this, so I'm not going to go in greater detail on that, but that's a huge piece of the equation that frankly we're just in the early stages from an industry perspective.
No, that I think, you know, we started off the session today, or this the day one was about supply chain security as part of the CSAS commentary. So I'd like to take that, expand it to Scott. You know, you have seen both sides of the equation, and also from the information sharing side. What are your thoughts on what level and what kind of stakeholders should we include in this conversation of protecting critical infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So I think the short answer is everyone, right? So within enterprises, you need robust security training and education programs to make sure the end users are aware of what they can do, right? And not phishing is such a successful attack vector because it works, right? Even so, educating people on how to identify suspicious emails. We all know these things. We all talk about them, but yet I think the fact that they're still working shows that there's more education and training that needs to be done. I think there's promoting security as a market differentiator to customers is a big component as well. So, you know, maybe in utilities, most people don't have a choice of who their power company is, but in other industries, their consumer choice is there, and promoting the security and integrity, resiliency of your product is could be a differentiator in the marketplace. Obviously, you know. Power companies, they often talk about their reliability rates, which is great, and that's all important. And I get a newsletter from my power company that talks about the investments that they're making in security, including cybersecurity, and that's reassuring, right? As a customer, it's good to know. So I think, you know, everyone's a stakeholder because we all have an interest in a secure and resilient infrastructure, whether it's an IT infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, financial services. I think this is one of the reasons why you're seeing a lot of cooperation between companies as well, because companies within industries sectors understand that, you know, it's good for the industry as a whole. It's good for their business to have people trust their industry. So there's a lot of successful collaboration that goes on. Yes, there's a benefit to the companies themselves, but there's also a larger benefit to the industry that they're serving. And I think that this is part of the another reason why cross-sector collaboration, which we don't talk about as often as maybe we should, is important. Understanding the interdependencies. So how does a failure in electricity impact my ability to produce oil and gas, as an example? So understanding those interdependencies and how you're dependent on other sectors helps build your business continuity, helps you ensure resiliency for your downstream customers.
Thank you, Scott. And next, talking about this stakeholder group, Brian, you reminded me of the painful truth that we have to deal with is when the right people are not introduced at the right time, especially during a transaction, right? I mean, I've been part of the transactions due diligence with you, and typically the CISO teams, are ones the later to know. And the senior leadership wants to keep the head tight. So of course, during the due diligence, you have several things to consider. So what are your thoughts, Brian, in terms of getting the right stakeholders and expanding the circle a little bit to make sure that the key issues are dealt with upfront?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult problem. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time with when we work with organizations is helping them develop a plan to work with corp dev to get to corp dev, because typically they're the ones who are in charge of the cadence by which a transaction occurs. So we have to have a plan, and corp dev has to buy into it. And so I would typically want to see the security organization be brought in no later than the letter of intent stage, which is typically where these transactions start off. And you want to have communication from the very beginning with the security and the data privacy team. It's often a different team. And they need to understand, what is the vision with respect to this transaction? What is the investment thesis? Is it is there going to be a complete integration? Is it going to be a partial integration? Is it going to be mostly standalone? Is this going to be a carve out, or are they acquiring the entire entity? And the security and the data privacy people have to understand this from the beginning, so they can start planning from the beginning, and so that they can start working with the appropriate outside vendors as appropriate to assist with this sort of thing. Because there are various stages that you need to go through it. Some of it's planning, some of it's assessment, and some of it is technical testing. And you're usually going to work with third-party outsiders to do that technical testing or the assessment, the diligence. And more, the courts are coming down. There was a decision just this past year from the District of Maryland in Springmeier versus Marriott, basically saying that technical testing is an important part of an acquisition, and if you don't do it, there's a risk that the court is going to find you negligent. So getting the right people involved early on and having them involved throughout the transaction is really critical. And as I suggested, the main way to do that is to plan in advance, to create a M&A playbook or something to that effect, and to get the buy-in of corporate development and high-level management. Very important.
Excellent. Thank you for reinforcing some of my learnings, and of course, I think this is very critical to have the right people involved at the right time, and the sooner the better. So, thank you, Brian. Well, for the last question of the last round, Stephen, I think I'd like to see and hear your thoughts around the stakeholder group again, because I think security has been treated as a technology issue for a long time, and then we have regulatory implications, then we have financial implications, and now it's very serious, infrastructural implications. So your thoughts to close off this round?
Yeah, glad to. If we think about the world of energy today, it's very polarizing. There's the IT organization that's trying to protect the data. And then there's an OT/ISC group that's trying to protect stability and, more importantly, system disruption. And whoever can cross that chasm is in a very rarefied space. And that's how it used to be in the financial industry and tech industry 10 years ago. I think the past can predict the future. And not only do we have to help the energy sector modernize itself from regulatory compliance and innovation technology, they have to completely reorganize the way they do business, people, process, and then technology. If you think about some of the most successful companies out there today, they're leveraging enterprise agile and scaled agile deployments. And they're developing based upon a product which integrates the business and IT and operations. You're no longer looking at an over-the-fence throw from development into deployment. You've got a single organization, going back to a theme of DevSecOps and CI/CDs. So I think organizationally, the industry, and more importantly, any of these enterprises have to modernize themselves to operate more like the successful companies in the past that have already figured it out. So I'll stop there, because I think that's one of the biggest places we haven't had a chance to go deep on. How do you organizationally construct a company that integrates IT, OT, ISC, just as if it was a product and platform?
Excellent. So again, thank you, gentlemen. I know we're a couple of minutes over, but this was a very insightful session. Tobias, Scott, Brian, Stephen, thank you for your collective wisdom and the great diversity thought that you bring in. I'm sure this is the first of many discussions from here, and we will collectively address the need for critical infrastructure security together, especially in the energy sector. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.